Wonderful. Welcome, everyone. As always, we'll give you all a second to get comfy and sign in to today's episode. We're very excited about today.
It's going to be a good episode today. They're all good episodes, but
yes,
I'm super excited about today's topic.
We're always like, this is a good one. We picked it, so.
All right. Folks are filtering in.
Jen, you're on top of the world over there.
I know. Well, I'm doing this from home today, and I used to have a little screen that I was able to put up that I don't have anymore. And when I blurred the background, you could see a fan swimming in the background. So I thought, why not look at Nashville's built environment while we talk about Urban Heat Island?
You're always on top of things.
I was thinking on this one. On my background today.
I love it. I should have done that. Perfect. Well, I think most of the folks who are going to be joining us are probably coming in right now. So why don't we kind of welcome everyone to the show. Welcome. We are here today with Sustainable in the City. Today's episode, we're excited to have Assistant Professor Dr. Alisa Haas and Research Assistant Sophia Roberts from Middle Tennessee State University. They're going to be talking to us about the health implications of the heat island effect, how it relates to environmental justice, and ways that we as community members can hopefully protect our most vulnerable neighbors. As always, Sustainable in the City is a partnership between Jen's organization, Zero Waste Nashville, and my organization, Urban Green Lab. And we are very, very excited about today's episode. I'm already sweating. I'm ready for the heat talk. And we're ready to go. Jen, I know you woke up pretty early today, but I think we're going to do a great episode. I'm on vacation. You're sleepy. We got two lovely ladies who are ready to wow us as the guests. And I am very, very excited.
You're absolutely right. I got up at 5 a.m. I am not a morning person, but I am feeling sharp. And I'm going to remind everybody about our Q&A and our chat before we get started. So let's cover these quick logistics, and then we will get into our topic. So just as a reminder, in the last few episodes, we've kind of changed our format and how we collect questions from you all so that we can better prioritize those questions and make sure questions are getting answered. So what we are using is the Q&A section. So you'll notice in your Zoom controls, there's two little talking bubbles and it says Q&A. So that's what you are going to use to ask any questions that you want posed to our guests, Sophia and Alisa. So make sure you're using that Q&A for your questions. We cannot guarantee that they will, if you put them in the chat, that we'll be able to get to them. There's just a lot of moving parts. So make sure you put them in the Q&A. I'll try and remind folks as well in the chat to do that as well. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't use the chat. Make sure you select everyone in the chat, because we always like to have conversation going on the side about today's topic. So continue to do that in the chat here as well. And so we are going to pose you a quick question so you all can get used to the chat. So you're going to ask we're going to ask you a question in the chat, and then I want you all to select everyone and answer the question in the chat so that we are sure everybody knows how to use it. So our question for today. So we all know heat can be very dangerous. It's what we're chatting about today. So to get the conversation started, what are some ways that you, our audience, how do you beat the heat and stay safe? So that is your question today. Christina, so go ahead and put it in the chat. Type your ways to beat the heat in the chat and stay safe. Christina, do you have any tips you want to share about how to beat the heat and keep cool?
Yeah, I saw something recently that was like, if you put a bowl of ice water in front of just a regular old box fan, it's almost like having an AC.
Wow.
So I've been wanting to try that, but I haven't had a chance yet. So if anybody's done that, I would love to hear about it in the chat.
Oh, interesting. I just got a notice from a work chat that it's disabled.
That the chat is disabled.
That the chat's disabled, which is why we're not hearing from anyone, which is super odd. Let me just double check here. I didn't change any different settings. Oh my gosh.
Well, all right, folks are putting it in the Q&A at least.
Wait for it. I think I fixed it. Everybody, Woo! That's a big thank you to Allie Omens to help us out with that. Excellent.
Allie, always coming to the rescue,
Oh,
Allie.
goodness.
Thank you.
Oh, this is perfect. Hydrate, stay inside. Take a hike in the woods. So you got the tree cover. Ooh, whoever's got the pool, I'm super jealous.
Yeah.
Stay at the trees, shady greenway. I thought people were being really quiet this afternoon. It's like, where is everyone? This is great. Ooh, homemade fruit popsicles. Oh, that sounds really, really good.
Yes. Cooling
Wonderful.
towels. Mhm.
All right. There's a few of you I am noticing you are answering to just hosts and panelists. So make sure, this is why we do this quick check. Make sure you select that you are replying to everyone when you pop things in the chat. That way everybody can see what's going on. This is perfect. Hammock time under the trees. I love it.
Yes. Outdoor tasks early. I like that. That's good.
Yes. Awesome. All right. So I think we are good. We've figured out the chat. I figured out how to set it correctly so you all can use the chat. And we are going to go ahead and move forward. So just as a reminder, this episode is being recorded and it will be put on YouTube. So don't forget to subscribe as well to the YouTube channel. So Christina will put a link to that in the chat for everyone. So you can make sure you check out all of our previous episodes that we've had before. And with that, I am going to officially turn it over to our wonderful guests, Sophia and Alisa, to get started talking today about urban heat island effect. All right, turning it over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to quick share my screen. So as Jen and Christina mentioned, I'm Alisa Haas. I am in the Department of Geosciences at Middle Tennessee State. And my research is based on urban heat islands. And so you might be wondering, why are we going to focus on urban areas? We are all in the same climate as rural areas. Rural areas also encounter heat waves. So why do we focus on urban areas? And the big reason we focus on urban areas is because of the urban heat island effect. So the urban heat island effect is when the urban area is warmer than a rural area and it doesn't cool as effectively at night. So you can see on this image here, downtown areas are often much, much warmer. In this case, we're 7 degrees warmer than a rural area, but this can actually be up to 15, 20 degrees, depending on the actual urban area itself, how big it is, and what the rural area is like. And so if you look at this image over here, we have a satellite image. And so any of the gray area that you're looking at is concrete. And this is a big part of why urban areas are so warm. There's just a lot of concrete. So concrete is the gray areas. As you guessed, vegetation is the green areas. And if we look at a heat signature map, you can see these bright red areas, which means warm temperature, are correlating to where we have our major city, our major roadways, and so on. So any of these green areas, which are more vegetated, are much cooler. So why do urban areas have such a warm temperature, especially as compared to rural areas? It's because urban areas really create their own temperature. And so in rural areas, we have potentially lots of water, we have vegetation, we have wind flowing through naturally, and this helps keep that cooler. In urban areas, we have lots of concrete, what we call impervious surfaces, so asphalt, concrete, our buildings are concrete or brick. All of these surfaces hold on to heat. So it absorbs it and it very slowly releases it. But we also have buildings that are packed very close together, which disrupts winds, it traps all of that heat. And we're also creating our own heat. So anytime we're running our air conditioners, that's creating heat. Our vehicles are creating heat. If you've ever stood on the side of the road and a bus drives by and you get that big blast of hot air, that's what we call anthropogenic heat. So it's the heat that we produce, and then that gets trapped in our urban area. So this is just an image of, this is actually really close to my house, but it gives a really good sense of what the surfaces are actually doing with heat. And so on your left, this is a thermal image of surface temperature. So the more towards red that you get, the warmer it is. And so inside this circle here is 113 degrees Fahrenheit on the surface, and that is concrete. Versus over here in the shade, under a tree, it's much cooler. It's going down more towards, this isn't 21 degrees but more about probably 70 degrees. So if we look at the actual paired image over here, I went out and I took air temperature readings, and this correlates to what these surfaces are doing. So in the concrete, where the concrete was 113 degrees, the air temperature was 94. When we're looking under here, shady in trees, the air temperature was only 77. And I would say this is probably 10 feet apart. So it is not a huge difference, but we have these big differences in microclimates in urban areas. So if you think about, we've had lots of heat waves this summer. This image is actually from 2019, but this is very similar to a number of conditions that we've experienced this summer. So think about Nashville having a heat index, which is the combined feeling of temperature and humidity. Being in the South, I think we all know that the more humidity we have, the warmer it feels to us. So this heat index of 104, very warm, you'll be sweating. It'll be probably hard for your sweat to evaporate, meaning it's hard for you to cool down. So this data traditionally, when we're talking about how do we measure the urban heat island, is coming from weather stations. And typically the weather station we're looking at is the airport. So BNA is our airport around here that we're using for weather. That's the numbers you're getting from the National Weather Service forecast office over in Nashville. But is that representative of what you are experiencing? So think about if you walk into this kind of foggy forest, is that going to feel the same as being on a tarmac? Probably not. You're probably going to be pretty hot on that tarmac and not so hot in this forest. So if we think about what we're experiencing on a daily basis, I can say for myself, I do not live in a tarmac. And so that's not what I'm experiencing, but that's where we get our traditional data from. So to better understand how hot it is in the city and how this varies throughout the city, there's a number of different ways that we collect data. And so we need finer scale data. So this is actually Knoxville, is one of my study sites. And so the Knoxville airport down in this area here would give us the temperature for Knoxville that would be reported on the news and so forth. But we need to get down closer to neighborhood level if we want to better understand how our residents are being exposed. So the neighborhood on the left, you can see densely packed buildings, lots of concrete, there's lots of roads. It's going to be pretty warm as compared to the neighborhood on the right, where our buildings are much more spaced out. There's a lot more shade, a lot more vegetation, and there's not these big highways running through that neighborhood. So there's a number of different ways that we can actually collect this data. So the first one is probably what you would most likely expect, and that's we place weather stations strategically in different neighborhoods around an urban area. We can get real-time data coming in every 5 minutes, every hour, however we want to set that. We also can put small sensors out, which is a lot cheaper, and we can put more out to get more information. We also can use satellite data. So satellite data, like you're seeing here, this is temperature. The more red, the warmer, more towards blue would be cooler. The problem with satellite data often is that it's just too coarse for us to get down to the street level. We also can do heat mapping. And so heat mapping actually takes data directly from specific routes around the city on the roads and gives you a map like what you're seeing here. So this is Boston, and you can see there's specifically hot spots within Boston that are very, very warm as compared to areas probably more towards the suburbs and natural areas that are very cool. And what's fun is that here in Nashville, we're going to be actually doing heat mapping in the next couple of weeks. And so heat mapping is part of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association or Administration's Heat Watch campaign. And so we are having citizens in Nashville come out, volunteer with us. They're going to put these little sensors that you're seeing on their cars on their car, and you drive a specific route throughout the city 1 up to 3 times a day. And these sensors collect data every 1 second. So as you're driving, usually 35 miles an hour or under, it's collecting data very, very often. Tens of thousands of data points are coming in. And so this really gives us an idea of where in the city we need to pinpoint putting more adaptation and mitigation measures in place and making sure that vulnerable populations that are living in these areas have the resources they need to reduce their exposure. So if you are interested in volunteering, like I said, we're actually going to be doing this in the next couple of weeks. There is a link down here that you can go to, or you can just Google Nashville heat mapping, and this link will just pop up. There's a short training session to go through, and then you are pretty much good to go. So this is what it ends up looking like. So here's just another heat signature camera or image, but it ends up looking just like this. Richmond has a lot more of the roadways. You can see that this really hot areas are just kind of following these roadways. And then throughout it, where there's rivers or more natural areas, it's much cooler. So if we go back to this day, 104 heat index in Nashville. Some questions that we think about specifically in my research is, does neighborhood data tell you everything you need to know? Do I stand outside my house all day experiencing what my neighborhood is experiencing? Probably not. I'm going back and forth, taking my dog for a walk, being in my house, going to the office, whatever it may be. So what my neighborhood data is telling me may not be what I'm personally experiencing. How you perceive heat may be different. So do I think it's hot or not? I am from Wisconsin, so I think everything is hot all the time. I'm always saying it's just way too hot. I'm just not used to it, not acclimatized to it. How is your health affected? So maybe if you are a very healthy person, you're not as concerned about heat exposure. If you have a heart problem, kidney problems, or you're like me, maybe you're just not acclimatized to heat, your health might be more affected than somebody else's. What are you doing to deal with the heat? Do you have access to resources to keep yourself cool? Or are you just saying, I'm good to go, don't need to worry about it? And then how do we make these decisions? So all of these are questions that we ask in my research, and then we look at how this varies between different people. So this is bringing us even further down in scale to the individual level. And so we had our citywide data, we went down to our neighborhood level data, and now we're going to the individual. Like I said, I'm not standing on a tarmac all day. I'm not standing right outside my house in my neighborhood all day. That data is not necessarily representative of what I'm experiencing. So we want to know what an individual is experiencing to better be able to help everybody reduce exposure and reduce health effects. And I'm sorry we're getting dark. I'm in Murfreesboro and we have a storm moving in here. So to do this, when we want to look at how people are exposed, individuals, we use little sensors. So you can see the little sensors circled in yellow here, and these are called eye buttons. So these eye buttons collect day, so what day we're collecting on, the time, usually we're collecting about every 5 minutes, and then they collect temperature and humidity. So there's no GPS going on, we're not following people around, but we do get a really good sense of how individuals are being exposed to heat as they move around throughout their day. So this graph here that you're seeing, this is from one of our personal exposure studies in Knoxville back in 2017 when we had a heat wave. And you can see the orange line here, which is about 105 degrees. This is the temperature at which we start seeing health effects occur more often. And the blue line here, which would be 75 degrees Fahrenheit, the orange line is heat index. This one would be 75 degrees Fahrenheit, because at night, the National Weather Service says we need to cool below 75 degrees Fahrenheit to keep our bodies cooler and recover from heat exposure. So the solid black line, you can see this is following a pretty similar pattern as you would expect when you are looking at daily temperatures. And so it's a little bit cooler in the morning, gets warmer during the day, cools off at night, warmer during the day, and so on. That's our airport temperature. So that's what we're getting with the weather station at the airport. This dotted line is average exposure for 38 people during this heat wave. So the really great thing is that our participants were not as exposed during the daytime as they could have been if they were outside all day, but they were very exposed at night, meaning they never dropped below that 75 degrees. And that becomes a really big problem because when we don't have time to cool our bodies off at night, we start getting cumulative exposure. So it's day after day of this exposure of hot weather that we're not actually recovering from, meaning we can then start having a lot more health problems. So the good news, we're finding urban residents are taking a lot of measures to reduce their exposure to heat during heat waves. That's fantastic. So they're getting the message that there's heat advisories, excessive heat warnings, and so forth, and they're taking measures to keep themselves cool. The not so great news is that urban residents are often more exposed during normal, what we call climatic conditions. So just normal summer temperatures. So what we actually found is we repeated the study during normal summer temperatures. And we found that because people were not receiving these warnings, communication on what they should do to protect themselves, they were going about their lives as normal. But now they were more exposed during the day. And when you're more exposed during the day, you're likely going to be experiencing more heat. So instead of staying inside during the day, maybe they're going outside gardening, walking, whatever they do. The other part of this is that urban residents are more exposed at night. And so this is a separate study that includes a lot of the data that I just showed you. So this, what I'm showing you here is based on 4 different studies throughout the southeastern US where we looked at personal exposure data. So this is times when the maximum temperature for the day occurred at weather stations. And so you can see at the weather stations, most of our maximum temperatures occur between 12 o'clock and 4 o'clock p.m. This is our individual data. Again, it's the maximum temperature that each individual, we had hundreds of individuals included on this study. So this is the maximum temperature individuals were exposed to. Instead of it being concentrated in these afternoon hours, we're now seeing high temperatures being actually experienced all throughout the day, including in the middle of the night. So again, if we're not cooling off at night, we're not allowing our bodies to recover, we start having a lot of problems with health. So another one of our projects from this past summer is working with teenagers. And so this is the Urban Heat Youth Fellows, and it was in collaboration with the Cumberland River Compact and the Nashville National Weather Service. And the idea is that we wanted to understand how teens were exposed to heat. So we're specifically looking at 15 to 18-year-olds. And we want to understand how do they think about heat, how are they exposed, and how do they best understand and receive risk messaging. And so it was kind of a 2-for-1. We got our research data, we got to see how these teens were actually exposed, and then we also provided a 2-week-long educational program. So they came in, they learned all about what the urban heat island is, how do we protect ourselves, who's vulnerable more than others, and how do you, they actually got to develop their own scientific study where they would take 3 sensors, place it around their house, anywhere they thought would be either hot or cold, and then they brought those sensors back the next week. We looked at them, they were able to graph out their data and determine were their hypotheses right or not and why. So then the other part of this was risk messaging. So teenagers, the reason that we are really interested in teenagers is because nobody really has studied how they are exposed. And teenagers are kind of a unique population in that their jobs are very different than what adults are having. Maybe they're lifeguards, maybe they're working at summer camps, maybe they're babysitting, they might be out in heat more often. And they aren't receiving risk messaging, so heat advisories, excessive heat warnings, those kinds of things in the same way. So we wanted to understand better, how do they receive this information? How do they understand this information? And where we can actually get this information to them. So maybe they are like, Facebook is for old people, we would rather be on TikTok or Instagram. And so this is just a better way of us understanding how do we get the message out so they can keep themselves safe. So when we really stop and think about Why do we go down to the individual level and why heat map? It's because vulnerability varies throughout an urban area. So this can be by socioeconomics and demographics. We know people with a very large or a very strong social support network often do better during any sort of a hazard, but especially heat. So if you have someone living next to you or someone in the city that you know very well and they check in on you, you're more likely to survive if you have some sort of a heat illness. We know that people who are older and very, very young have a really hard time regulating their body temperatures. So they're more at risk for heat-related illnesses. And of course, there's other things that will affect how you're exposed, how vulnerable you are, and one of those is income. So if you live somewhere that it's very warm and you cannot afford air conditioning or you don't have an air conditioner, suddenly your exposure goes up quite a bit. And vulnerability also varies by location. We talked about neighborhood. It also can be the setup of your neighborhood. So on the left side of the bottom image here, you're seeing a fairly well vegetated neighborhood with a safe sidewalk. And on the right side, you're seeing a neighborhood that's a little bit more, or quite a bit more, all concrete. What we actually find is that when we have neighborhoods that have very safe, walkable areas, people are more connected to their neighbors. And when we're more connected, again, it comes back to that social support system. You have a stronger social support system, and you typically have someone checking in on you, you can check in on your neighbors, and typically we survive hazards a little bit more easily. The other part of this, which is a big part of my research, is perception. So how do we actually think about heat? So these are just quotes that we got via surveys on how people are thinking about heat. Some people are really concerned about health problems. So if they have heart problems and they have trouble breathing, maybe they're more concerned about heat and they're more likely to take adaptation or adaptive measures. We also get a lot of, because we're in the South and we have very warm summers every year, we get a bit of apathy. So we're used to the heat. Something I experience every year, it's always hot, it would disturb my routine, or maybe you're just not able to change your routine so that you can reduce your exposure. So that's all I have to say at the moment. I do invite anyone, if you want to talk about this further, after this is done, to email me at any time.
Fantastic. Wonderful. So as a reminder, everyone, you can put your questions for Dr. Haas and Ms. Roberts in the Q&A feature, and we'll be sure to get that to them at the end of the episode. But we also have some questions for y'all right now to dive in a little bit more about this super interesting work. There's just something about heat exposure that it's so seemingly simple, and yet when you see it kind of out, seeing like the airport versus the forested area or whatnot, and it's just you start to really think about how much it really varies and how interesting it is and how we're all affected by it. And so it's like this one of these very like tangible sustainability topics. So really, really appreciate everything that you've already kind of laid out for us. And now hopefully we can get a little bit deeper and learn about y'all a little bit more. So I would love to hear from both of you, Alisa and Sophia, kind of how you found yourself working within the field of extreme heat in urban areas. Like, what has your journey looked like? Alisa, I know that you are a bioclimatologist. I would love to hear kind of what that means. And Sophia, same for you, environmental sociologist. What does that mean? What does your journey look like to come to this work?
Yeah, I mean, I can start here. So I didn't know what I wanted to do for the majority of my younger years after high school. And so I kind of bounced around a lot until I found the field of geography. And within geography, we are so varied in what we cover. And what I love is that I can do the science side of climatology, but I also can do the social science part of it. So I'm a bioclimatologist. You can also call me an applied climatologist, a hazard climatologist, whatever you want to call it. But the big part of that is that I do the science part, and then I get to go help people and I get to work with people. And that's what really drives my research it drives me to get up every day is that I know that I'm not just doing theoretical work, I'm doing work that can actually be helpful to our community. So that's really how I rolled into this. I was originally doing paleoclimate work, so looking at settlement and fire histories and so forth. And I love that, and it's valuable research. But for me, I really need that connection with my community.
And Sophia, sorry, I just want to ask Alisa one more thing. So when you say you did paleo research, that's like when you do like sediments and ice cores and really go like super far back into our climatology and study that. But now you're kind of more in like what's happening right now with the people who are being affected by it. So that's kind of your shift.
Yes, exactly.
Very historical to very current.
Yes.
Love that. Wonderful. And Sophia, yeah, same question. Kind of what does your journey looks like? Of course, you're in your undergraduate studies, so your journey is in ways just starting. But we would love to hear that and a little bit more about what it means to be an environmental sociologist.
Yeah, so I am an undergraduate student at MTSU. I will be entering my second semester junior year this fall, kind of confusing, but I major in sociology with a concentration in social justice and minor in environmental science. So I love that intersection that is environmental justice, both for the planet and for the people. And I would say I landed this research assistant gig by mere fate almost. I was really hoping for some sort of project or opportunity during my undergraduate years, and this opportunity just popped up at the perfect time. I was in one of my absolute favorite courses I've ever taken, is a sociology course, Environment and Society. So very fitting that I heard about it from this professor that this research project was happening and they were looking for some assistance, and I was like, why not? So I inquired my interest and that for any more details, and here I am. So I didn't necessarily go out looking specifically for heat related things, but I'm definitely not complaining. I love the work that I've been able to do, and everybody that I've been working with this summer is awesome. So I would still consider myself a sort of like student sociologist, but I've had amazing mentors at MTSU that have shown me what it looks like to be an amazing sociologist and environmental sociologist, from like Dr. Angela Mertig, Dr. Meredith Dye, and of course, Dr. Adele Monteblanco, who helped on this. So I think for me, for what I've learned and what I've seen from all of these amazing people, is that being an environmental sociologist is, looking at the connection between humans and the environment, because these aspects can easily fall through the cracks if you're looking at things through the perspective of other disciplines. So environmental sociology helps build that bridge to help understand the impact, the dependency, just that sort of connection between the environment and communities. And though the focus on the environment within the broad, all-encompassing field of sociology is rather new, I would argue that it's definitely super important as criminology or family studies or anything. So I recognize I definitely have a way to go, big shoes to fill, but I'm very excited to continue my work in such an important field. So I love it.
Awesome. Fantastic. And you don't have to fill anybody's shoes. You create your own shoes. And you're doing a great job so far. I love it. So this can be for both of you, and you've touched on it a little bit just in your answer of kind of what you do for your work, but obviously sustainability is a very broad term. We talk on this series, being more sustainable and living more sustainably touches on our waste, our energy, our electricity use, on methods and modes of transportation, on pollution and green space, on water and what we wear, essentially everything. And so today we're obviously talking about heat, but I would just love to know a little bit more about, what does sustainability mean to you personally? What does that look like for you in any way that you want to answer that?
Okay, so I guess I'll go. So for me, sustainability, I think sustainability very broadly, in that we need resources to live our everyday lives, but we need to use those resources in a way that's, well, sustainable. And so we want to live a good quality of life, but we want to make sure that our resources are available for future generations to live a good quality of life. And part of that is environmental risk. And so any of our environmental hazards, we don't want to make these worse for future generations, because that is also part of sustainability, is that we just want to make sure that our future generations are good to go. And at the same time, we're still happy with our lives. And so there's that balance between the two.
Sophia, anything that you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would say when I think of sustainability, I think more so like obviously everything that she said, but also like on the other hand, like how just thinking every day with the environment in mind. I know like when I was growing up, I would always want like new things. I'd want brand new outfits for school, all new school supplies when back to school season came around. It's really exciting. But as I've grown up, I've seen the unnecessary waste that produces. So I've grown into thinking like, okay, let's like make do with what we already have, shop more strategically. And I've been able to use like an iPad for all my school related things instead of using all that paper and new notebooks. But even that shows how sustainability is different between person to person, because not everybody would have that financial capacity to obtain a tablet. So it's just sort of, not taking the environment for granted, thinking like, will this have negative impacts on the environment, and how can I personally avoid contributing to that?
Yeah, that's really beautiful. You both of you are very well spoken, but just it's lovely to hear someone who is on the younger spectrum really understanding kind of what is going on here, and that we can and can't keep going the way that we've been going. And it's not about having a poor quality of life. It's making the choices within the circumstances that you live in. I just think that that's really important to talk about, because I think there can sometimes be shame with sustainability because, I can't get this product or I can't make this choice, but it's making the most sustainable choice the most often. So I just really appreciate both of those answers. Thank you, ladies. So what are you talked about this a little bit, but like, what are you working on now or in the future that you're most excited about? And maybe that might be the youth fellowship and heat mapping, and maybe you could talk about that just a little bit more. You talked about, why we're using heat mapping in general, but would just love to hear more about what you're excited about coming up and with your work.
Yeah, so I think the most exciting thing for me is the heat mapping, only because we've been working on it for so long. We got this great funding and it's now coming up. So we've been working pretty much for almost a year now on this, but this summer has been such a big push to get volunteers. So I'm really excited to actually get out, meet with our volunteers, actually see this data start coming in. And then about 6 weeks from our actually heat mapping time is when we'll start getting the process data back, and that'll be publicly available. So it's something that anybody in the community can have access to. And you can look at where is it hot and where is it cool in the city. I am really still interested in continuing our Urban Heat Youth Fellowship program. And so hopefully we're working on getting some funding, because this is a free program for Nashville youth. So we're working on getting some funding so we can continue and hopefully expand this program, both in terms of the number of people that we can serve, but also potentially expanding to other areas.
Awesome, great. Anything you're excited about, Sophia, or basically same?
Oh, I have like many things, and it's like this semester is gonna be super cool. One of the biggest things that's like coming right up is additionally this summer I've been working with the Sunrise Movement in Nashville as a fellow, and we are holding it's for statewide. It's our Tennessee Youth Summit for Climate Justice, and it's this weekend. We've been working towards it all summer, so I'm super excited, and I'm actually going to be teaching a class, a session there, and I'll be discussing this heat project. So it's super big, super exciting. And then also the other undergraduate research assistant on this Urban Heat Youth Fellows, we are going to be conducting our own little side research project this semester under the guidance of the amazing Dr. Haas here. And we're super excited about that, going to be presenting at a conference later this year. And then I will also be presenting myself at a sociological conference later this year. And so many things on my plate, but I love everything that I've been able to do and will be doing. So yeah.
Fantastic. I love it. Wow. It all sounds wonderful. And I appreciate my other question that I was going to ask is why work with youth? And I appreciate Dr. Haas when you were talking about kind of like that messaging and making sure that they're aware of the risk and how they can kind of help mitigate it. So I think you handled that question, but I just wanted to kind of put a finer point on that. You also talked a little bit, but I would love to dive in a little bit more about kind of how equity intersects with this work.
Yeah, so it's hard to avoid equity in any circumstance, but it's very apparent where it ties into with the environment. So the environmental injustice movement, so if you've heard of the term like environmental racism, that movement gained a lot of momentum in the early 1980s and was further supported when the scientists' data and all the research was confirming what people's experiences were. And that is that some communities are disproportionately impacted by climate change consequences than others. That's a bit of a mouthful, but we're still seeing that today across environmental issues and in local and in global sense. So these communities that are being impacted more are the BIPOC communities, the Black, Indigenous, people of color, and or those of low income. So these are the people that are facing many obstacles in their road. They're facing housing discrimination, whether it's like present discrimination or remnants of things like redlining. They also just lack that general funding for their community, leaving them with things that are not up to date or even up to code aspects around their neighborhood, which is obviously not healthy for them. They have many obstacles trying to obtain adequate and proper healthcare. So all of these issues just stack on top of each other, leaving them very much more susceptible to environmental hazards. Think of how easy it would be for them to be exposed to air or water pollution. So in the instance of urban heat, you think of like an unhoused individual. They may not have that reoccurring access to a building with air conditioning. It may be hard for them to find a place in the urban area that has that greenery, that has that shade. They may not have consistent access to cold food or drinks to help cool them off. So it's kind of looking in terms of equity, it's looking at how all of these obstacles open the door to how can we make this unequal distribution of hazards more fair, if we can even do that. Like what policies need to be changed, what facilities could be established to help certain populations with certain targets. Like how can we find equity in this suffering? And so you think of kind of tying into like environmental sociology, where this is how we look at the environment and people and how they interact, but the disparity that is often there and how can we approach that? So in this project, we've been able to have our target population that we were looking at be youth, because youth populations have been easily overlooked in this sort of realm of research. So our aim was, one of the many aims was, to look at, are there any sort of disparities in how the Nashville youth are exposed and they experience heat, or even their perception, their understanding, even their knowledge of urban heat in general and how to adapt to those hazards. So it's just a long-winded way to say that equity is definitely deep-rooted in urban heat, but of course, in general, every sort of environmental issue.
Very, very well said, Sophia. Thank you for that. And I would love to hear a little bit more about, so you really talked about kind of that individual risk profile, kind of based off of kind of socioeconomic circumstances that someone is in and what that means for the system that they're in. But something that I think is really interesting that comes up a lot with heat, and you touched on it just a little bit, Dr. Haas, was kind of like this gentrification of areas and kind of losing that community. So do you mind talking to that just a little bit?
Yeah, so in terms of equity, we really are seeing areas that are more, I don't want to say run down, but they haven't had funding put into them, right? Mm-hmm. So we're talking about historically redlined areas like Sophia had mentioned, areas that are being gentrified. Any area that we're looking at that maybe has a high crime rate, maybe doesn't have that social support system, we really see a lot of problems with heat. So in Nashville itself, our areas that are historically redlined are our warmest areas based on previous studies. So warmest areas within the entire metro area. So that's one of the things that we're looking at, is how do we pinpoint these areas and make sure that the investment then gets into these most vulnerable areas that maybe haven't been invested in before. The other part with crime is that a lot of times if you live in a very high crime area, maybe if you don't have an effective cooling system, like a swamp cooler, AC, anything like that, or you can't afford to run it, you may not also want to open your windows because of high crime. You're worried about somebody actually breaking in. And so what we end up seeing is that areas that are high crime, maybe we don't have the means to actually run a cooling system. Those residences get very, very hot. And so I always think back to the 1995 heat wave in Chicago. There are so many instances of elderly people who didn't want to leave their apartments because they were worried about people breaking in, or they didn't want to open their windows. And there were so many people who perished just because of that. And so it's a really, really big problem.
Yeah. Thank you for putting a finer point on that. And that specifically that Chicago heat wave, I remember part of it was the fact that these areas were also changing due to gentrification and kind of new folks coming in and not knowing their neighbors and not having that social net that maybe folks were used to before. And now you have elderly folks a lot of times, and they kind of lost those ties to the folks around them. So kind of a plug to get to know your neighbors if you are in a new neighborhood, and making sure that they know that you're a friendly face. So I know we have some questions in the chat, so I'm going to kind of just maybe not go through every single one that we have in here, but I would love if you could just explain a little bit about kind of climate change and extreme heat and kind of what that looks like for Nashville, and just kind of generally also, you know, what's the difference between an extreme heat day and a summer day? So like, what are the kind of differences there, I guess?
Yeah, so I'll start with extreme heat versus summer. So our summer temperature in August, average high temperature is about 89, 90 degrees Fahrenheit. When we start looking at more of an extreme heat event, it would be something that the National Weather Service would put either a heat advisory out for or an extreme heat warning. And so the numbers that the National Weather Services uses, so for heat advisory, it's 105 degrees Fahrenheit heat index during the day, and it stays above 75 degrees temperature at night. And then the extreme heat warning just goes warmer during the day. So we're looking at a heat index of 110 and up. We did hit that this summer. So that was the first time in many years that we've hit that. So the difference is the numbers that we're actually looking at, the actual intensity of the heat. Down here in the South, the higher the humidity, the more easily we're gonna reach those heat indexes. But those numbers are actually based on various things that we have going on specifically in this area. So it's how acclimatized are we? What is our climate normally like? It's when health starts to be really affected. So if you go up north, like I mentioned, I'm from the north, heat advisories start kicking in when it's about 95 degrees heat index. So they're not as used to it. Health effects are going to start happening much earlier. So the difference there is just, when are we going to start getting sick, basically? When do we really need to make sure people are taking precautions? And then the second part of this, with the climate change, what we're seeing in specifically the Southeast, Middle Tennessee, is for heat waves themselves, they're becoming more frequent, they're becoming longer, they are more intense, so they're much warmer as well. But it also pertains to our summertime temperatures. So our normal summer conditions are becoming warmer, and what we call our heat season, kind of like a growing season, a hurricane season, tornado season, that's becoming longer. So when we experience extreme temperatures or very warm, dangerous temperatures, is occurring earlier in the spring and later in the fall. And so it's just becoming longer, which again is very similar to like a growing season, which is great. We have longer to grow, but it's also becoming much warmer. And then the other piece on that is that our nights are warming very quickly. They're actually warming more than our day is. And as I mentioned, nighttime heat is really, really dangerous. And so this is a big concern that we've been looking at lately.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. Do you know if there's any new programs or efforts at the community or city level that might reduce kind of the impact of development and the impact of development of a heat island effect?
Yeah, so I always like to highlight Cumberland River Compact and Route Nashville. And so they've got a couple of programs. One is called Depave, and that is breaking up areas of excessive or unneeded concrete and asphalt. And so they are breaking this up. They are turning it more into a playground, a natural space. And that allows cooler because you don't have all of that impervious surface, but also allows water to actually infiltrate through the soil. So it reduces our urban flooding, doesn't overwhelm our stormwater systems. And then Root Nashville is kind of the other one that I always like to highlight, that they are focused on planting 500,000 trees in the city by 2050. And so I believe they're over 25,000 now. It's in partnership with Metro Nashville. And so they're really targeting areas that are warmer, but anybody in the urban area can plant trees and contribute towards this. So they're volunteer-based, really great organizations to be part of.
Awesome. Anything else that we want to kind of point out for audience members that they can do to kind of help either reduce the urban heat island effect, or at least help their vulnerable neighbors, or maybe they're vulnerable and they need some help? Any advice that you have for our audience?
I think it's a lot of what we touched on. Get to know your neighbors. I know I'm super introverted, and when I moved here, I didn't want to talk to anyone because I just want to go home and like be by myself. But get to know your neighbors. When I moved here, I knew nobody, and so now like my next door neighbors, I all know. And if something did happen to me, they would be on my door knocking and asking what's going on. But also I can return that favor. So yes, it's, if you have the ability, plant trees in your area, make sure that everyone around you has access to cooling. And just really keep up with your adaptation and stay out of the extreme heat and drink your water.
Definitely. And I guess right before we go into these questions, I see them in the Q&A. So last call, if you have a burning question for our ladies today. I just want to know if you have any advice, maybe even specifically Sophia, since you're kind of in this new part of your journey. Do you have any advice for those interested in sustainability work?
My biggest thing is just like, do it. Do something. If you see needs in your community that aren't being met, no matter your age, no matter your experience, like, don't be afraid to like do something about it. Talk to your officials, share your concerns, partner with organizations. And then if you want to join an environmental club at your school, if there's not one, start one, become a member of an organization. It's just about like jumping in there. If you want to add on things in your academic career, like I love learning things about like in the classroom and also like pursuing them outside of the classroom. I think that's really cool. So it's all about just taking that first step and knowing that in regards to heat, that you may live in the same city under the same sky, but everybody's experience and perception of heat and environmental issues are different. So you have to just kind of think of everybody, think of the environment. And obviously we are always wanting everybody that we can ever get, and everybody's all are welcome. So it's just just start somewhere. The smallest step is just like the best way to start.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That was a beautiful way to end. So why don't we, Jen, come on back and let's do some Q&A questions. I saw some good ones in there, so I'm excited to hear the answers for them.
Yeah, we definitely have some very good questions in here. All right. So I'm just going to go in order as I do. Actually, no, there's one that's been upvoted. There's a few upvotes. Look at that. So if you want to upvote things, that helps us be able to order things and prioritize, and we're going to get started. Okay. So I have resorted my list. If people over precautionate and don't get used to the heat, does that make them more vulnerable to heat and actually more at risk?
So I believe what the question is asking, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is whether, like, let's say there's a heat wave coming through and you simply stay in the air conditioning the entire time and you never leave it. So you're not becoming accustomed to that heat.
Yeah.
On the short term, I can't say on the long term because we haven't done those studies yet. On the short term, they are less at risk because they're not leaving their place. So I will say, in my first heat exposure study that I ever did, we had a university student who just was like, I just want to play video games the entire time there's a heat wave. I don't want to leave. It was during the summer, and he was so funny about this because he's like, you're not even going to like my data because it just flatlined, and it was. But he was not exposed to anything. He didn't get sick versus people who were working elsewhere, specifically like outside, maybe in a pizza place where it's really hot, those kinds of things. And so if your air conditioning suddenly cuts off, then yes, you probably will be a little bit more at risk because you are not acclimatized as much.
Very interesting question. Okay. Next one, do you map and compare temperatures before, during, and after land is cleared for development?
So this is a whole side of climatology and sustainability land cover studies. And so a lot of times what happens with these types of studies, because we're looking at a larger spatial scale, is we use satellite data for that. And so there is a lot of satellite data coming in that people are analyzing, looking at what did land used to look like, what does it look like now, how much erosion are we seeing, what is the temperatures that we're seeing, does that increase evaporation and thus drought? And it just kind of snowballs from there. So some people actually do this. We do it on a maybe a smaller scale if we're going to put small weather stations out in the city, but there is a whole line of research that does that.
Very interesting. I know we'll probably have a lot of development questions here in Nashville, as you know, that certainly the rapid growth of the city, I'm sure, has impacted our heat. So definitely saw a few questions related to that. This next one, so Alan asks, in the past, he's used a heat map in his neighborhood to convince neighbors to plant trees, as we are a heat island. It will help to have a heat island map along with a leafed out tree map that's easily downloadable so that neighbors can see the effects of tree shade. So he's wondering if we will have this, or if you're familiar with any resources. I know one was shared in the chat that he's looked at that really didn't have the kind of detail I was looking for. So just curious if there's any pairing of those two resources that you know of.
So I'm not sure about the leafed out map, and that will be ever changing, and it'll be something that needs to be updated pretty often. For the terms of what we will be producing with our heat mapping, we will not have a tree leafed out map with it, but you will have access to the actual heat map itself. So you can look down closer to your city level or your street level.
Great. Okay. Next question. If we're able to cool off during the day, will we still see the cumulative effects of heat even if our night temperature is above the 75-degree mark?
So this is actually really interesting that you asked that, because it's kind of it's a tangent of my research that we're looking at when our people are exposed. So yes, if you, like, let's say you work the night shift or you're a night owl and you are being more exposed at night, but you're cooling off during the day, you've got your AC set at 72 or whatever it may be, and you have several hours inside for your body to cool off. It's the same exact thing as being able to cool at night. So you just need at some point throughout the day, several consecutive hours of your body being able to recover.
That's good to know. My office is absolutely freezing, so I'm glad to know I'm getting that time, because my nights are, I realize we keep our temperature above 75 degrees, which maybe we shouldn't. Okay, next question. Are you working with, I think you mentioned this, but just in case there's anything that you missed, are you working with Root Nashville to plant trees in areas that need to be cooled down? I think you touched on that.
Yeah, so Root Nashville and Metro Nashville are the ones leading that. And so we try to assist them if we can, but mostly it would be, if they ask for it, would be measuring temperature. And so they are actually part of them, and Cumberland River Compact, because they're connected, are part of the heat mapping as well. And so they're really helping us out, trying to figure out where do we actually need to map to get more information.
That's great. And I will throw out there too, that we did have an episode with Root Nashville. So if you go and check out that previous episode, I think they talked a little bit about this in more detail as well. Sophia, did you have anything else to add?
Yeah, I was just gonna say that Root Nashville, you're able to, probably they said it in that episode, but just like a quick summary is that it's free trees. They just need like volunteers to plant it. And you could even, if you live like in the Nashville area, you can get them to actually come out to your home and they'll plant it for you. You get to pick out what tree. So yeah, it's just like they just want volunteers or like a community leader to help lead, figure out where in that community specifically trees are needed. But it's definitely a neat program to check out.
That's great. Yeah, absolutely. Having the community input on where the need is really important. If you don't tell people where you need your trees, there's only so much data that we're collecting. So I think that's a really, really good point to have that community input. Our next two questions are development related. I'm going to roll them together because they're both kind of material related. So one of the questions is asking about kind of building materials like reflective materials, or are there types of building materials that may help prevent absorption of heat? And then also talking very similarly about roadways. I know you mentioned the depave, but this was talking about asphalt. Are there other ways to seal blacktop driveways and roadways beyond the black tar sealer? Are there other materials that can be regulated to be used besides asphalt? So just throwing those two questions together.
Yeah, so there's all sorts of technology coming out that are really cool. They have developed, this was the most recent thing that I saw, is that they've developed the whitest white paint. And so it's supposed to be just the absolute purest white color that you can use for your driveways, for your roofing, for the sides of your house, that can reflect that heat and get it away from your house. It reduces cooling costs and so forth. As far as concretes, like when we're actually looking at roadways, sidewalks, those kinds of things, something that I've recently seen is that they are trying to put solar panels in them to actually power electric cars and so forth, those electric bikes and all of that. When we're talking about buildings themselves, having green roofs is extremely helpful. It helps reduce the amount of heating and cooling as needed, and it'll keep that area a little bit cooler. There's also some, I'm kind of more talking about novel things, but there's some cool building materials that are actually breathable. So they have kind of, I think of them as gills. And so when the building actually gets really warm, the gills expand out and it releases heat away from the building. And then the gills expand back down when it gets a little bit cooler and it can retain heat. And so that's pretty cool as well. When we're talking about very reflective materials, what often ends up happening if you have your buildings really close together is that heat then just kind of reflects back and forth between the building. And so unless you have a breeze coming through there to actually mix those temperatures, mix that air, it's not going to be super helpful.
Wow, I've never even thought about that. I've always thought about reflective buildings and just the impact of birds, and just, unfortunately it's not good for birds because they don't see that there's a building there. So, but I just never thought about that interplay between the buildings together. So I'm always fascinated with architecture and how it impacts our built environment and our climate. So, all right, the next question we have, not only humans, but plants are suffering from this excessive heat. Gardens are not producing food. I've noticed that myself this summer. So heat mapping is important. Oh, this is just a comment. There's not a question associated with it, but it's a great comment. It's important for future food production as well. So that was the comment. Is there any other kind of thoughts you want to put onto that comment?
Not too much. I don't do too much with agriculture, but it's exactly correct that we need to be very aware of this and then adjust our growing methods accordingly, or maybe what seeds we're growing and what kind of crops we're growing in specific areas.
Absolutely. All right. Somebody put in two questions into one question, so I'm going to read them both. Large swaths of East Nashville, Inglewood were constructed without sidewalks. What's the cost benefit of adding concrete versus connecting neighbors with walkable streets? Ooh, that's a very interesting question. And are there viable shade alternatives to trees, given how long it will take for those trees to reach maturity? I've been envisioning vaulted tarps with solar panels on the sun-facing side. Yeah,
so not having sidewalks isn't a deal breaker. It comes down to, yes, sidewalks are important, but like I think of the neighborhood that I live right next to and I walk my dog on it. There's no sidewalks, but it's a safe neighborhood. I know I don't even live in that neighborhood and I know a number of the people out there. So it's more about the ability to get out and feel safe in your neighborhood in that typically will build more of a social connection between people. So I'm not really sure about the cost benefits on that. I don't have the numbers for that. So I won't comment on that, but it's more about like how are we able to connect with people next to us? Do we feel safe enough to get out and actually do that? Can you remind me of the second question?
Yes, I just, hold on. I gotta scroll back to it. Okay. Oh, the viable shade alternatives to trees. So the vaulted tarp, solar panels, those types of things.
Yeah, and that's basically it. Do you have a sunshade? Those sun sail things. I was actually thinking about getting one of those for my open patio because it's completely blocked in and it gets really, really hot back there every day. Those can also help cool your patio, which if it's connected to your house can help keep your house a little bit cooler. But yes, so those are all options until your trees actually grow. And any way you can create shade is a great way to keep your area a little bit cooler.
Sure. Okay, our next question is, how do local elevation differences affect heat gain or heat loss in the individual? We notice quite significant local elevation differences in neighborhoods nearby. They also said thank you for the extremely interesting presentation.
Well, thank you for that. Yes, so we think a lot about elevational changes when we're looking at, like I said, I went to grad school over in Knoxville, and so we often thought about how are bluffs affecting our temperatures? If we go up the mountain, how is that affecting us? When we have these huge elevational changes, like you're driving up the side of the Smoky Mountains, it's going to be cooler up at the top of the Smoky Mountains than down in Gatlinburg, for instance. When we're talking about a hill within your city, you might find that it might be warmer during the day at the bottom of the hill and cooler up top. You have more air mixing. But then at night, sometimes what you get is cold air drainage. And so you'll actually get cold air that filters down the side of the hill itself and settles at the bottom of that hill. So it might be a little bit colder there at night. It really depends on the specific topography that's within each of these little areas.
Wow, that is really fascinating.
Yeah, we have to be really careful about where we put weather stations because we don't want to be affected by that.
Yeah. All right. I love this question. Are there favored trees to plant
I don't know.
for heat?
Yeah, I mean, I would say anything that has a big canopy and that you know is going to live a long time. So I know we plant a lot of Bradford pears around here, but they are not a long-term plants. They just do not survive after about 15, 20 years. And you're going to be right back to where you start from. So I would say any species that can have a big, like really full canopy and will last a long time would be a really good bet.
That's great. I think we did. Yes, we covered the Root Nashville group. Travis, I think we have answered this question about impacts with or connection with Root Nashville. So we have answered that really. What are the dangers of not cooling off at all during a 24-hour day? We keep our AC at 78 or above all the time. We open windows at night as often as we can. I think this is a really interesting question, especially as folks are trying to save on those energy costs and, you know, that other piece of sustainability with our energy. So how does that kind of work? And should I also lower my thermostat to below 75?
Yeah, so I remember in June, early July, when we were having those excessive heat waves, TVA had put an announcement out because we were worried about energy consumption and being able to provide for everyone and not have blackouts, that people should keep their thermostat at 82. And I was like, oh my goodness, like, please don't do that. But I absolutely do understand that the cooler we keep our houses, the more heat we're actually producing outside, making everything worse. When we do have a high demand on our energy, it does help to turn your thermostat up a degree or two so that we don't have rolling brownouts or blackouts or anything like that. So when we're talking about you're going to stay very warm, it will depend, first of all, on humidity. The higher the humidity, the harder it is for our bodies to cool off. So if you have a low humidity space and your thermostat is at 78, you might be just fine. But if you have a little bit higher humidity in your house and you keep your thermostat at 80 and you're never cooling off, maybe you go outside for a walk and it's 105 out or whatever the case may be, you can start being dehydrated, you can start having muscle cramps. we're finding there's a lot of mental health issues associated with heat. And then obviously you can go into a little bit of the harder things. So you start getting migraines, you can have heat stroke, you can have heat exhaustion. A lot of people who have a lot of heart problems will have heart issues creep up. Kidney issues can creep up. Some medications might affect how you're affected as well. So it is really helpful to find time to actually cool off at night or at some point throughout the day.
That's great. Yeah. So maybe 78 for most of the day, but if you can find a couple of hours in there to allow your body to cool off and bring it down.
Absolutely.
That's great. So there was one question that someone had posed that I did type an answer to because I'm not sure that y'all would be able to answer this question, but I'm going to share it anyway, just in case you do have any insight here. It's a great question. Given the future expectations of increased heat events, what heat crisis plans does Nashville or Davidson County have? For example, opening public buildings as refuges for those who do not have adequate AC. Is this type of crisis as well planned as flood and tornado crises, for example? I also mentioned that I am going to pose this question to our Metro leadership too, to just see, but I wasn't sure if you all knew of anything in particular that the city does in terms of that. I'm more familiar with our flood plans.
So I actually have a couple of students working on heat mitigation plans right now. So they're looking throughout Tennessee to see what hazard mitigation plans actually include heat. And for the most part, our state does not include heat as a really big thing they need to prepare for. But Nashville and Davidson does, as well as Knoxville does as well. And so there is heat included in the hazard mitigation plan for the entire area here. In terms of what kind of infrastructure we're doing, they do open more cooling shelters when there is advisories and warnings. The problem ends up becoming is how do you get the word out to people who need these? So if you're unhoused, if you maybe don't have the internet, you can't just Google to figure out where these are. The other problem is if you don't have transportation to get there. So we need that infrastructure worked into it. I know there was another program that I saw on the news. It was really interesting that they were giving out free air conditioning. So if you, I believe if you had a specific health problem, or you were under a certain income level, you were able to get a free window air conditioner for the summer. So I thought that was pretty cool as well.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah.
I think there's also, we'll find a link to it, but I think also there's been some pilot programs around opening some more community shelters here in Metro. My 5 a.m. brain though is escaping the specifics here on this one. So you'll have to excuse me, but I'll pull up what I can find on that, and we can share that in the follow-up too. Well, that was the last question that I saw in the Q&A, and I see that we are right at 1:13, so right on time. This has been incredibly fascinating, incredibly interesting, wonderful conversation, and just really both of you are so well-spoken and passionate about this work. It's nice to see what's being done now. And Sophia, to see what you're going to do in the future for us is incredible. So we just really both appreciate all of your time today to share this information. Christina, am I leaving anything out as a closing? No, I'm seeing a shaking of the head. No. So thanks everyone. As always, we'll be sending out the follow-up email that'll have resources as well as a link to the video today. And if you do think of any other questions, feel free to email those and follow up and we'll pass those along. And with that, thank you so much again to both of you for your time today, and we will see everybody next month. We're going to hold off on telling you who our guest is, and but we'll see you back here in a month, second Wednesday of the month for Sustainable in the City. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.